We're going to go ahead and get started if you want to find your seat. Great to see you all here tonight. Let's start out with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Good and gracious God, we thank you for all your many gifts. We thank you for our faith. We thank you for your Son. We thank you for Thomas Merton and John Paul Merton and the influence they've had on our faith. We thank you for Deacon Bill and Dr. Megan. So we thank you for this evening tonight. May it always increase our faith and let us grow closer to your Son, Jesus Christ. So let's say, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. I've been looking so forward to this night because Thomas Merton had such a big effect on me. When I converted to Catholicism, I read Seven Story Mountain and was just blown away. And I can remember my first trip to Gethsemane and thinking of Merton coming down those roads, and I was just so excited. So Thomas Merton has always been a big influence on me, and we're very pleased tonight to have two very special guests with us. Deacon Bill Grimes. Deacon Bill is a deacon for the Diocese of Lexington. He's also a physician's assistant and has run a clinic for the homeless, people that can't pay, for 23 years now. Is that right, Deacon? So he talks the talk and walks the walk. He's a great guy. But he was also a novice under Merton for 3 years and knew Thomas Merton very well. So we're very happy to have him here. And also, of course, Dr. Mill Megan. He's one of our own here at Holy Spirit Parish, the Newman Center. We're blessed to have him, a very noted psychologist. And so much has been written about Merton, and Dr. Megan found a niche that somebody had not written about. And his book has received such wonderful accolades. I just want to read one thing about the book. This is from Christine Boken. She's Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York. She's a founding member and past president of the International Thomas Merton Society and co-author of the Thomas Merton Encyclopedia. This is what she wrote about Dr. Megan's book. Once I started this book, I could not put it down. William Megan invites us to remember John Paul as he was, not just the monk's writer's younger brother, but a brave and deeply spiritual person in his own right. Another reason for my gratitude for your work is how, through the example of John Paul, you invite us to acknowledge and revisit the reality and the beauty of ordinary spirituality, or, as you put it, the quietly lived spirituality. Thus, John Paul's life, with all its twists and turns, its troubles and triumphs, becomes a reminder that God is to be sought and found in the ordinary. Meticulously researched, written with clarity and grace, this book contributes significantly to our understanding of the whole Merton family. I know I will never be reading the Seven Story Mountain in quite the same way. It's a must read. So we're very blessed to have both of these men. And Dr. Megan, after the talk, Dr. Megan will be signing his books, and we have some other Merton books available also. So, Dr. Megan, Deacon Bill.
Yes, the mic is on, and I don't do sitting down very well, so I'm going to stand. There are some ground rules, okay? And the first ground rule is, if as I talk, you have a question or a comment or a quip or a quote, just raise your hand or speak it out. Just don't yell. And the other ground rule is, if you're like me and you've been to some talks, sometimes the speaker turns out to be kind of boring, and you lose interest, and you tend to nod off. So if you do that, I would suggest be seated in your seat in such a way that you fall asleep falling backwards, okay? Yeah. Now, the danger is if you were to be seated and you wind up falling forward, you're going to make a lot of noise. You'll fall out of your seat. You'll draw attention to yourself. You don't want to do that. And the other thing possible is if you're sitting and you get the sense that you're going to go, you could lean to the right or the left, but just check who's on your right and your left, because you don't want to be leaning on the wrong person and wind up in trouble. All right? So I have 42 versions of this talk, and none of them are here. But I'm going to start this way. My Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself, and the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you, and I hope that I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Given that I wrote a book about John Paul, and what I said was I did not want to get distracted in writing it by focusing on Thomas in the book and the stories, so I avoided Thomas and it was real tough to do that because some interesting stuff. So why would I start with this? It's Thomas. Well, it's because I want to believe he's writing about John Paul. John Paul didn't know where he was going. He had no real clear path in his life. He was aimless. His mother dies when he's 28 months. He has no living memory of her. His father leaves with his brother and takes off for several years. Comes back in 1923 and leaves Tom, and his father takes off again. John Paul never sees him again, except 1 or 2 summer vacations. His father dies in 1931. John Paul's an orphan, and I think he was 12. Well, not only is he an orphan by his biological parents, but he's orphaned again, because when he's in college, his grandfather, Sam Jenkins, dies when he's in the first year of college, and his grandmother, Maddie, dies when he's a sophomore. He had lived with them all through the time when his father left him. He was blessed to be able to live with them. But again, at a young age, he suffers being orphaned twice. He winds up going to a boarding school in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg Academy, for high school. He's on his own. He gets the nickname Wild Man. In one of the annuals for that academy, they had this thing where it says, what if? What if that's what? And one of them was, what if Mert wasn't a wild man? We don't know much about how he was wild, except that he didn't break any rules. He never got in any trouble. The faculty liked him. They thought he was a good student. So the next kind of tragedy in his life is he goes to Cornell, spends 5 years. Talk about aimless. First 2 years he wants to be a scientist. He loads up on science courses and fails half of them, is put on probation. Then he switches to history and takes a couple of courses, but in looking at his transcript, which I was fortunate enough to get, there's no pattern in the transcript of where he was headed. You couldn't tell that he was selecting a history major because there was Russian courses and courses in Chinese history He finished Cornell in 5 years with 3 probations, and he was expelled. He had 90 credits of the 120 required, and he doesn't get a degree. So that summer is 1940, and he's visiting his brother in Olean. And one of his brother's friends says to him, "What are you going to do about the draft?" Well, he wanted to get in to the Army at that time. But he tried the Navy, he tried the Army, couldn't make it. So he says, "If I don't get in, I'll drive to Mexico and take pictures of Mayan ruins." So he spends 9 months in Mexico taking pictures. The next loss is when he finally gets in to the Royal Canadian Air Force, he wants to be a pilot. He had already taken flying lessons at Ithaca's airport. He had 8 hours of solo, I think it was solo flying. He wanted to be a pilot. He's interviewed to get into the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the person who interviews him, Flight Officer Keyes, says, "Upstanding young man, well-educated, fit for flight, fit to be an officer." He goes into his first training session that lasted several months in Toronto, and he doesn't make the cut. He's not going to be a pilot. Okay, now I've kind of gone over the top of some of the things that would have taken many of us and just put us in the dregs. We would have been wiped out. Despite all of that, this guy is an optimist. He's got a positive attitude. He's well-liked by people. He's loved by many. He didn't lose any of the sense of the joy of life, but he was, in a sense, kind of aimless until the Air Force. Okay, so that being said, let me switch into the main text. The first title of this book was The Law of Love, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But Mary Donnelly, Mary Donnelly is a former Newman Center person. She ran one of the child education things. As Mary was helping me as a volunteer, and she saw the title and she said, "No, that's not good." And I said, "Mary, it's his spirit." And she said, "Yeah, but it's not going to sell books." So we came up with Remembering the Forgotten Merton. She said, "That's really what this book is about." Because after you did your research, you realized nobody had mentioned him. And I was down at Gethsemane at the very beginning of this, and I talked to a couple of the monks, and I said, "I'm starting to get interested in Thomas Merton's brother." And one of the monks looked at me and he said, "He had a brother?" Another one said, "I think he had a brother, but I don't know his name." Then I looked at all the literature. Not much at all. In Seven Storey Mountain, the index has 16 citations for John Paul. If you look at those, most of them are Tom referring to John Paul in relation to what Tom was doing. Rarely does he talk about John Paul. Parentheses, he didn't understand John Paul because Tom was not aimless. They were different birds. So the first title was The Law of Love, and I'll sketch out where that comes from. In 1923, Tom is back in Virginia Avenue, Douglaston, New York, living with his grandparents, with John Paul. His father is in Africa and Europe. Read the book. He's in a relationship with a woman, and he's painting, and he's out off doing his thing. When Owen met Ruth, the parents, Owen said to Ruth, "You have to understand, I love art more than I love you." So that's the theme throughout Owen's whole life. So he left the kids. So, okay, in 1923, John Paul and Thomas are together. Tom is about 3.5 to 4 years older. Tom has some friends on Virginia Avenue. There's a big field behind their house, and they're building a hut. And John Paul, despite the fact that his brother had already kind of treated him badly, wanted to hang out with them. So John Paul approaches the hut. This perplexed 5-year-old kid in short pants and a kind of leather jacket, standing quite still with his arms hanging down at his sides and gazing in our direction, afraid to come any nearer on account of the stones. They threw stones at him to keep him away. As insulted as he is saddened, and his eyes full of indignation and sorrow, and yet he does not go away. We shout at him to get out of there, to beat it, to go home, and wing a couple more rocks in that direction. And he does not go away. We tell him to play in some other place. He does not move. And there he stands, not sobbing, not crying, but angry and unhappy and offended and tremendously sad. And yet he's fascinated by what we are doing, nailing shingles all over our hut. And his tremendous desire to be with us and to do what we are doing will not permit him to go away. The law written in his nature says he must be with his elder brother and do what he is doing. And he cannot understand why this law of love is being wildly and unjustly violated. Thomas Merton, when he wrote Seven Storey Mountain, captures what was his nature of his brother, but it never carried through from Thomas's point of view throughout their whole life. But John Paul lived this law of love out of a nature, and he did it so naturally. One of the things I never wrote, but I used to think was, he lived it, Thomas Merton wrote it. So in the very beginning, you can sense this 5-year-old kid is living out of a sense of love. He wants to be with people, and that's the theme throughout his whole life. So the next story that captures John Paul at a very young age, in terms of how determined he is, comes in the same time frame. Tom had a bunch of guys he hung out with, and they would go to the next neighborhood, which was Little Neck, and taunt the gang in Little Neck. So one day, Tom is with his friends in his house, and the gang from Little Neck decides to come over to Douglaston and get it on with Tom and his boys. So there's about 20, 25 thugs standing in front of Tom's house. Tom and his friends stay in the house. They know they're there. They stay in the house. And then the protection of the house was lost when the cleaning lady, Frida, ordered the boys to leave the house so she could clean. They ran out the back of Tom's house and raced through the backyard to Bill Boyer's house, a neighbor. The Little Neck gang of boys did not leave and stayed in the street for quite a while. They were waiting to get it on. And then an extraordinary thing happened, says Thomas. The front door of our house at the other end of the lot opened. My little brother John Paul came walking down the steps with a certain amount of dignity and calm. He crossed the street and started across the lot. He walked towards the Little Neck gang. They all turned towards him. He kept on walking and walked right into the middle of them. One or two of them took their hands out of their pockets. John Paul just looked at them, turning his head from one side and then to the other. And he walked right through the middle of them. And nobody even touched him. And so he came to the house where we were. We didn't chase him away. This kid had a spirit about him that was deep, and he wasn't going to be intimidated. Now, there's some people who would say he was competing with his brother. He was showing his brother up by doing what his brother was afraid to do. Fiona Gardner is a member of the Great Britain and Ireland Society, and she's written a paper on the relationship of John Paul and Thomas, missing in action, the brothers, the relationship of the brothers. She used an early manuscript of My Law of Love as part of what she based that article on. That article is probably being published now. She's going to do a review of this book in September. Fiona Gardner is a psychoanalyst and retired, and now she's a spiritual director in Bath, England. Fiona Gardner said in her article, he was probably competing with his brother. Well, she may be right. She may be right. 5-year-old kid. And I'm from Brooklyn. I know that scene. And I wouldn't have done what John Paul did at all. You'd take your life in your hands. So he was even wild as a 5-year-old. Wild in the sense that he just did what he thought he should do, did what he wanted to do. So that law of love continued throughout his life. So let me just hit the highlights of some of the instances that I was able to find that reflect that law of love. When he's at college in the summer between his 4th and 5th year, he's walking in Ithaca, and he sees this guy with a Russian wolfhound. Goes up to the guy, strikes a conversation, gets to be friendly, eventually gets adopted, in quotes, by Len Miskell and his wife, Rovine. Len was an engineer, his wife, Rovine, was a social worker. They love him, and he loves them. And they become, in a sense, a second family to John Paul. They have a daughter, Marilyn, and John Paul's a college kid, and he likes a good time. And some people, when I started to tell them that, they said, well, did he get it on with Marilyn? Not at all. Not at all. He became her close friend. He took her on hikes and taught her how to use a camera because he knew she was interested in the arts. So he gives of himself, maybe when he should have been studying, and he's a loving guy to this high school student. The previous summer, he drives up to Olean, where Tom is, and knowing that Tom does not drive, Thomas Merton didn't drive, he spends 2 days driving Tom around the mountains, showing him the scenery. This is a brother who doesn't understand him, but yet he's giving himself and his time to his brother. He's in Mexico. 1940, he took off to Mexico for 9 months. And what does he do? He meets a rancher who is down on his luck. He loans him $3,500. Now, John Paul had a nice allowance because his grandparents took care of him. His grandparents were well off. He loans the guy $3,500, and he tells Tom, and Tom says, well, what's going to happen? He says, well, I don't know. He said, I'll get it. He'll give me the money back or he'll give me a part of the ranch. Nothing ever happened. He lost the money. So he was a very giving person. When the war broke out, this is 1940. This is Dunkirk. This is the Battle of Britain. This is the Blitz. He's reading all about that. He wants to get into the action. He wants to get in. This country was highly neutral. We had the laws that made it impossible to enlist in a foreign country's military if they were at war, unless if you did, you would lose your citizenship. I struggled to find out whether it was illegal or whether you lost your citizenship. I think it wasn't illegal, but nonetheless they had FBI agents at the border with Canada, because a lot of people were going across the border and enlisting in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He wants to get in. Tom mentions it in Seven Storey Mountain. Tom is concerned because he doesn't know what he's going to do. He's literally, his moral attitude is challenged. And Tom finally decides, I can be a non-combatant. So he decides, that's what I'm going to do. So he goes down to the draft board when they call him, and he signs up as a non-combatant. He's never called because he goes to the medical, and he takes his medical exam, and he can't be accepted into the military because he doesn't have enough teeth. So he's relieved, and he's out of it. John Paul tries to get into the into the Army and into the Navy. Doesn't work. So he and a bunch of his buddies in Ithaca decide to go into Canada and join the Royal Canadian Air Force. And that's what they do. So he risks his citizenship to get into the action. He wants to be part of the solution. When he goes in, after the initial training, he's sent to Western Canada, but he drove across the border in his car, which was a fancy Buick because he had a lot of money, and he was going to give the car to the Miskells, Len and Rovine, the people that had kind of adopted him. But the car was in Toronto. One of the people that he went across the border with was in Toronto. He didn't get sent to Manitoba. So John Paul is writing this guy a couple of times saying, now, did you get the car back to the Miskells? Is that going to happen? He's worried about them getting the car. I mean, he's over there learning how to do whatever he's learning how to do, and he's more worried about the Miskells getting the car. When he gets stationed in England, he knows that it's too complicated to tell you the relationship, but Walter Hawke has a son, Walter, and Walter Jr. likes planes. John Paul knows this, so he spends time shopping for magazines in England that depict the warplanes, and he's sending them back to Walter Jr. He was concerned about other people in lots of different ways. This law of love kept operating in him. 3 days before the final crash, and I'll get to that, he goes out on a mission, and the squadron of 12 Wellington bombers loses at least one plane. And the one plane had his best friend, Bob Hart, in it. Bob and John Paul had been talking a lot, and they roomed together. And Bob had a fiancée, Beryl, and when he comes back, John Paul rushes over to where Beryl is And he says, don't worry about it. I know Bob. He would have gotten out okay. He'll be okay. Well, that's a pretty risky thing to do because 60% of the air crew of the RAF died. So that's a lot of people. 60. The average age, the average tour of a person like John Paul at his time was 2 weeks. It was high risk. So John Paul reassures Beryl, and sure enough, he's right. Bob was captured by the Germans, spent some time in the POW camp, and came back and married Beryl and named his son after John Paul. They had a tight relationship, and I was doing research and I found this website called something like Bomber Forum or Bomber Command or something, and I'm just playing around and I type in, does anybody know John Paul Merton, anything about him? Well, I get this response from this guy Charnley. He says, yeah. He said, I don't know him, but my friend Bob Hart knew him and thought the world of him. So from Charnley, I get information about Bob Hart and what their relationship was like. Serendipity in the research. That was more than, okay, that's that. Okay, so when he's in England, he's been in London a couple of times because he had 4 transatlantic trips on summer vacations. So he's in England, London, and he's got a couple of days off before he has to go to Upper Heyford where he's going to get more training. So he's in London, and it's a London that's very different than he's used to. He's used to staying in the Grand Hotel and being on the upside of everything. And this is a London that's bombed out with bricks and stones and rubbles. And he meets Margaret May Evans. She's in the Auxiliary Territorial Services. During World War II, most women had to do something. And they did, they willingly did. So she's in the Auxiliary Territorial Services. She's in her uniform. She's in London to interview to find out what her job is going to be. She eventually turns out working in an intelligence unit that sends decoded messages to Bletchley Hall. So Margaret describes meeting John Paul. We had only one evening of each other's company. He told me he was an American in the RCAF, and we chatted very generally about books, music, hobbies, etc., and he asked if I would correspond with him. This we did. And I gathered he was a keen photographer and one who was interested in its history. He was 6 feet tall, possibly a little more, and was so fair his hair looked almost white and he had blue eyes. He was a good-looking guy. There's a picture of him. I mean, he was a good-looking guy. He was a most gentle man with a wonderful smile and an air of complete serenity. He appreciated beautiful things, and as his father had found expression in painting, I think John Paul had his in photography. Our honeymoon was spent in Grasmere, the home of Wordsworth. Although it was February, it was the mildest winter in years. We walked for miles, taking photographs, visiting beauty spots, and making plans with youthful confidence of home in America when the war was over. I was never to see John again. So they marry on the 23rd of February. He's at Kermington on the East Coast in the 166 Squadron. Their mission was to either lay down mines in the water in the Irish Sea or bomb Germany. Essen, the Battle of Essen in 1942, 43, a little bit into 44, was an important part of the war because that was the industrial complex for Germany. That's where a lot of the natural resources came from, the oil. So the British decided to bomb it. The Wellington, I could bore you with details of what a Wellington medium-range bomber is and how it's constructed and its geodesic frame and its linen. I won't go there. In order to get the planes to Essen, to where they were going to Mannheim, they had to outfit the plane with more fuel than it was usually fitted out with. So they have extra tanks that they put in, and they strip the interior of the plane, and they take off. Okay, where is it? I didn't bring it. Is that me? They take off at 22:50 military time. No, they take off a little earlier. The crash is at 22:50 military time, April 16th, yesterday. I'm going to read this, but he dies on April 17th, about 3 hours later. So he died. The crash occurs at 22:50. We are 5 hours behind England. So on April 16th at 5:40 or 5, John Paul's plane is crashing. In Kentucky, Thomas is chanting Vespers. So at the time point, those two things happen at the same time. Thomas doesn't know anything about it, obviously. Okay, so the crash. They take off, they got a heavy load of bombs and a lot of fuel, more fuel than they usually carry. Haddingham was the rear gunner. It was a five crew. Haddingham writes, the engines both cut, and as we were carrying a full bomb and petrol load, our descent from then on was very rapid. I heard JPM, that's what we called him, JPM. We knew him amongst the crew as Mert. They called him Mert. Ask for permission to open the bomb doors in order to jettison the bombs. Flight Officer Lupton, the pilot, replied that it was too late and ordered us to prepare for immediate ditching. Seconds later, we had crashed nose first into the sea. That's important to know because John Paul's job was as a bomb aimer or an air observer. His position in the plane was in the very front of the plane next to the pilot. Plane goes down, the nose of the plane hits. That's where John Paul is. The sea was absolutely calm, and it was bright moonlight. There was no noise apart from the aircraft continuing on their mission overhead. The squadron was 12 medium-range bombers, and they crash, and the other 11 just keep going. There was no one else to be seen, and the dinghy took some time to appear on the surface in a partially inflated state. It was some distance away. I made my way into it, not an easy feat when wearing bulky and sodden flying gear. He lost his shoes getting in. Flight Officer Alan Lord, who was the radio guy, appeared, and I was able to help him aboard. So now Haddingham has Lord in the dinghy. There's no exact amount of time that we know, but it took some time from the crash to get the two of them in the dinghy, because they had to find it and all that. Sometime later, probably 3 or 4 minutes, he says, we heard shouts for help. We paddled the dinghy over and came upon John Paul, supporting Jack Lupton, who appeared to be unconscious. I should stop here. John Paul was raised in Douglaston, spent a lot of time swimming in the Long Island Sound and that area. So he was a good swimmer. He's just crashed. He sees his pilot, goes over to him, grabs him with one arm, uses one arm to keep them afloat. The rest of the story, and I'll give you the idea. We don't know whether his legs are working at that time or not. We don't. I went into this in the book. We don't know whether his legs were useless after the crash or whether that happened as a result of him trying to save the captain. But it's difficult to determine time in these circumstances, but I would think he would have been supporting Jack Lupton for at least 10 minutes. This whilst he was critically injured himself, an act of extreme bravery and selflessness which should have been recognized. He never got a medal. The pilot was unable to support himself, and this meant that Alan Lord had to hold on to him whilst I attempted to get JPM aboard. JPM was unable to help, and I found the task beyond me. He couldn't help them get in. He couldn't use his legs. By then we had presumed Jack Lupton to be dead. He was released to the sea. Alan Lord had to come to my assistance, and together we managed to get JPM into the dinghy. They had to pry Lupton out of John Paul's arms. He wouldn't let him go. It was obvious that JPM was very seriously injured. He was lucid for a period and was aware of his critical condition. Most of the time he had left was spent in prayer, and he died peacefully during the early hours of the 17th of April. Today is the anniversary of his death, 80 years ago. And I thank Father Steve for allowing it to happen that way. 80 years ago. I don't know how Thomas wrote this in Seven Story Mountain because I forget. But John Paul is in the dinghy. He's in the last stages of exhaustion. He's in pain. He can't move his legs. He asks for water. They don't have any. There's no water. He dies 3 hours later. Okay. He gave his life for his pilot, asks for water, and dies after 3 hours. What does that sound like? Thomas compares it to Christ and his death. Lord also wrote, Mert was in the last stages of exhaustion, been severely wounded about the forehead and unable to move from the waist down. In addition, he sank in the water until the sea entered his mouth every time he shouted, but it never occurred to him to let go of the pilot. Talk about the law of love. I mean, there it is. He's sacrificing himself. Now, at this time, America had just gotten into the war a year or so ago, in 41. The Brits had been doing that war on their own. They 39, 40, they were on their own. 41, they were trying to get America into the war. We were an isolationist country. We had neutrality acts that prevented the government from doing anything. Roosevelt figures out the Lend-Lease plan and gets something over there. But the Brits, the soldiers, didn't take too kindly to Americans because they carried the whole burden. So there was a lot of banter back and forth between the Americans who were in the British, or in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the British soldiers. Lord knows that, and he says, it never occurred to him to let go of the pilot. He was an American, And if I ever hear another running down the Yankees in the future, I will have a word ready. Lord got it, and he was not going to let anybody else criticize the Americans. Okay, so I've tried to lay out examples of the law of love. Thomas Merton never defined it in the Seven-Story Mountain. He named it, but he never defined it until about 1960. He writes this book for lay people called Life and Holiness. And basically, the thrust of the book is our job is to become saints. That's the job. Become a saint. And he says, but now the Christ has laid down his life and risen from the dead to take possession of us by his Spirit, the Spirit himself dwelling in us should be to us a law. This interior law, the new law, which is purely a law of love, is summed up in the word sonship. That was Thomas Merton. That was John Paul. He finally says it. The Holy Spirit infuses the soul so that doing the will of God is done not with fear, but with spontaneous love. So, I want to think about John Paul as somebody who lived that law of love in a very natural way. He didn't display it. He wasn't sterling about it. He didn't write about it. He was just an ordinary guy who did life the way he saw it, coming from the inside out, being who he was. And he winds up, I think, helping all of us see that just being who we are, being natural, being what was meant to be for us, is the way to a holy and spiritual life. Thank you.
I don't know how I'm going to follow that up. By the way, there was a great homily at the end. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Really, it was good. I'm going to use that next time I'm preaching. Can we let him stretch and stand up and stuff? Because you've been sitting for a long time. If you want to stand up and move around, and I can keep talking, or we can just take a, what should we do? Take a break, or just go ahead and, okay, just stand up in place and whatever. I want to talk about the other Merton, because now John Paul is number one in everybody's book, right? I can't wait to get home and read the book, to tell you the truth. I'm going to talk about the other Merton. Now, let me just start by giving you just a little autobiographical note here. I was born in Chicago. I had a miserable life. My parents were divorced. I was abused. I could not stand living at home. I wanted to get out of the house. When I went, you know what, remember when they used to have vocation talks at school? Of course, they talked to the boys about being priests and sisters, and the girls about being sisters, etc. Well, this Benedictine monk came and talked about becoming a monk or a priest. And then he said, we have a seminary for high school. It's a boarding school, St. Meinrad. I said, I want to be a priest because I wanted to get away from home, seriously. So I ended up spending 4 years at St. Meinrad when they used to have high school seminaries. We lived like Benedict, well, the Benedictine monks ran the school, and we kind of lived a monastic type life. Prayer 3 or 4 times a day, Mass every morning, study hall, learning Latin and Greek and all that stuff. I had a great education, and I loved being at St. Meinrad, and I wouldn't even go home in the summer. I'd stay there. And they let me live with the monks, and I ate with them and worked with them. I loved it. So I decided I had to become a monk. That was because I felt at home. I felt like I had a family. And I went to at the time it was Father Bonaventure, was the archabbot at St. Meinrad, and I asked him if I could become a monk. He said, sure, but you got to go to 2 years of college first. No, I want to do it now. He says, well, the only one I know that takes people without college is Gethsemane. I didn't know what the heck Gethsemane was. I mean, a Cistercian monastery is quite a bit stricter than a Benedictine monastery. And back then they had silence, okay? So I decided that I was going to go there. And one of the guys that graduated with me lived in Louisville, and he drove me to Gethsemane. And I think we got there after dark, and I had to knock on the door and ring the bell, and this old brother comes out, Anyway, they put me in the guest house, and he says, we're going to have somebody come and talk to you tomorrow. Okay, the novice master. So I'm waiting, and all of a sudden I hear the knock on the door, and the novice master comes in. His name was Father Lewis. I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea it was Thomas Merton. I'm glad I didn't know. Really. So let me describe. I decided that what you want to hear about from me is my relationship with Thomas Merton, what he was like as a person, right? Not what he wrote, because you can all read that stuff, okay? So the knock on the door, and come on in, and here is this priest, okay? He's in a Cistercian habit, of course. He's kind of rumpled. He's a little bit chubby. He's smiling. His eyes are twinkling. He's exactly what you would not expect in a monk, really. You see pictures with their hoods up and they're praying and they don't speak and and we talked. He sat. I was sitting on the bed. He sat on the chair. The room was only about 5 feet wide by 8 feet long. They're cells, basically. Anyway, he talks to me, and we talk, and we talk, and he laughs, and he tells jokes. And he's just cool. He's a really neat guy. And he said, let's go outside. It's too pretty to be stuck in here. We walked to the cow barn, and we sat over by the lake. And then we went back to the monastery. We sat under the ginkgo tree. Even if you've been there, you probably know what I'm talking about. And we talked for another hour. And I felt so good. I mean, I said, this is somebody I can relate to. I like this guy. And he said, well, I'll tell you, the other part was, he said, well, somebody else is going to talk to you this afternoon. I said, okay. Well, it turned out to be Father John Hughes Bamberger, psychiatrist. I didn't know he was a psychiatrist. I'm glad I didn't. But because then you started doing it. But anyway, Thomas Merton, and I didn't know Father Lewis was Thomas Merton for months. I always would stand in choir, and I'd be looking around, I wonder which one is Merton. I knew which one was, what was the other, Raymond Flanagan. I knew who he was, but I never could figure out who Thomas Merton was. And it was my novice master standing right behind me in choir. But anyway, this is the Thomas Merton that I knew, okay? And I am so glad. He was more than a teacher and a spiritual director and a mentor and a friend and a teacher. He was a father figure for me. He really was. Can you imagine having somebody like Thomas Merton? I didn't realize it at the time, how lucky I was. I did not realize it. And anyway, the novitiate was 2 years. After 2 years, the abbot, James Fox, says, well, I think it's time for you to take your simple vows. I said, you know what, I'm really not sure. Oh, yeah, you come on, we'll do it. We'll do it right here in the office. I said, no, I'm not sure. And I went and talked to my novice master, Father Lewis, and I told him, he says, don't let him push you into this. He does it all the time. Don't let him do it. Seriously. He says, you think about it. And I thought about it, and I ended up spending 2.5 years instead of 2 years. And I finally decided, you know what? This is going to sound very strange. Most people don't believe me. I think in studying Mariology, the study of the Virgin Mary, I realized that I wanted to get married and have a family. While I was in the monastery, that's my realization. Of course, now I'm married and have 9 kids and 54 grandchildren. And I didn't go to medical school at the time, and I couldn't figure out where it kept coming from. But anyway, So I want to tell you a little bit more about Thomas Merton as a novice master. As a teacher, he taught us every day. If you've ever seen the videos of Merton with his novices, that's where I was there in most of them. And he would teach us everything. I mean, he would teach church history, he would teach monastic history, he would teach scripture, and here's the thing. One day in walks these two secular people, two priests, into the conference room while he is giving his conference to the novices. And he says, I want to introduce you to a couple of people. This is Father Dan Berrigan, and this is Father Phil Berrigan. So I knew who Dan was. I didn't know who Phil was. And then afterwards, they talked to us about their work. This is in a monastery. I mean, think about that. A monk is telling me how I have to be involved in action in the world. I have to be caring for people in some way. I can't just be a person of prayer. That's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. But we call it orthopraxis. Take what you believe and put it into action. And he taught me that. And another day, I walk into choir, and here's this white-haired monk with a long white beard in a saffron robe. And it was Father Bede Griffith, okay, who was a Jesuit. I think he was a Jesuit. But anyway, as a teacher, there was nothing that was off limits. He was open about everything. You think, well, you expect the monk just to talk about religion and spirituality and prayer? No, he talked about that, yes, but that wasn't all. And by the way, Father, I don't have a watch, so you tell me when it's time to shut up, okay? Thank you. Now, he was my spiritual director. Did all the novices had the novice master as a spiritual director. By the way, did any of you ever read anything by James Finley? You know James Finley? He was in the novitiate with me. His name was Finbar, believe it or not. Finbar Finley. And I was Alcuin, Brother Alcuin, okay. But anyway, as a spiritual director, we would spend an hour every about 10 days, because there were like 10 novices, and we just took turns. And you would expect a spiritual director to say, well, now you need to do this, and you need to kneel straight, you need to take deep breaths, and you need to put all this stuff out of your mind. That wasn't the way he was a spiritual director. He'd say, how's your prayer life? How's it going? Do you feel close to God? Do you know that God loves you? Do you know that you are loved? Do you know that you are forgiven for anything you ever did wrong? Do you know how much you are loved by this God? Do you realize it? And it was like, yeah, but not with the intensity that you're talking about it, no. But then he would just talk about spiritual things that he thought would help. He didn't ever say to me, do this, 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 and this. Start with A, go to B, no, he never did that. He would just ask where I was at in my spiritual search. He would say, this is the one thing I learned. I still after, let's see, I entered 61 years ago and left 58 or whatever years ago. I still remember the things he told me about contemplative prayer and how important it is. And I still remember when he said, don't ever put an experience of God before God. Experiences don't really count. They're great, they make you feel good, but it's just an experience. You're not looking for an experience, you're looking for God. Okay? And that's true. And he would say, and don't count what rung of the ladder you're on. Like, I've made it to the 13th rung. I'm really good at this now. Every day you start at the bottom. Okay, you start over every day. And you start again every day. And if you fall, you just pick up and keep going. And that was his teaching. He was one-on-one with me and with each of the novices as a spiritual director. But he lived it. He didn't just talk about it, he lived it. I had the privilege of serving his Mass, maybe once every couple of weeks. And this is one place where, yes, he looked like a very holy man when he said Mass. And you could tell he wasn't on earth, he was somewhere. Okay, he was totally immersed in what he was doing. You know, he was taking bread and wine and making it the body and blood of Christ. And it was just marvelous to listen to him and to watch him. And when he would be speaking as our teacher, he would get off on a tangent of something absolutely breathtaking. Now let me give you another example. One night in winter, after morning prayer started at 3 a.m., and then we had matins and lauds, and then at about 5 a.m. we left to go for prayer time before we had breakfast, and then went for prime and then Eucharist. And of course, you know that you've heard of the great silence, right? There's a certain time that you don't talk. Well, we never talked. That was another thing I didn't like very much. We never talked. We had sign language, but anyway, we used it a lot, let me tell you. We learned how to tell jokes in sign language too. But one night after the morning office, we used to go out the back door, and there was a garden, and then there was a novitiate. And I walked out, and there were 2 or 3 of the other novices standing there, and Father Lewis was standing. He was kind of like this, and he was looking at this plant. And you could tell he was like, where was he? I don't know where he was. But it was a night-blooming cactus. It only blooms, I think this is correct, it only blooms once a year during a full moon in the winter. And then the next day, a handwritten poem was on the bulletin board in the novitiate, and you probably know that it's at least in one of his books, you know, the night flowering cactus. And see, that was a spiritual, it wasn't just an experience, he became that flower. He really did. He became that flower, and he was transformed. And I saw him another time. He couldn't drive. Not only could he not drive, the abbot wouldn't even let him drive. He couldn't use a screwdriver. He couldn't use the pliers. He didn't know how to use a hammer. He was totally helpless at that kind of stuff. And so he would get me to drive him around. And I'd get a Jeep, and he'd carry him, and he'd say, let's go up to the old railroad station. And I think it's called Trappist. But anyway, I'd drive him up there, and he'd take pictures. And he took pictures of me while I was up there, too. And I should have brought them, but they're at home. But the camera he was using was from John Howard Griffin. You know, Black Like Me? Remember the book? Okay. So we were not, hard to say what I mean here. I wasn't just his novice helping him do something. We were actually becoming friends. And that's something way above all the rest, I think. To the point that after I left, I went back to see him 4 times. And if you read his journals, he'll say, well, I was working on my introduction to such and such. Somebody knocks on the door, and it's Brother Alcuin, Bill Grimes. And he gets all, you know, and here I am trying to be a hermit, and these people are coming in all the time, and blah, blah, blah. He goes on and on. But then he says, but we had a great visit. So I brought him a bottle of wine. At that time, I was with the Little Brothers of the Poor in Chicago, which is a French organization, and the chef had made beef bourguignon, and I had a pot of that and a bottle of Burgundy. And so he was happy to see me. But anyway, I went back a couple other times. I was fortunate to be at his funeral. I was invited to come to his funeral. There weren't a lot of people there. But if you can ever imagine what a funeral for him would have been like. First of all, he died in Bangkok. You know how he died, right? He was not embalmed, but he was in a coffin. And the monks didn't get buried in coffins. They just lowered him to the ground. But in his case, because it had been like 7 to 10 days since he died, they couldn't They had to so they had a funeral director to come and they had somebody dig an actual plot. But we were there as they were lowering the coffin. And did you ever hear of hoarfrost? All of a sudden there was hoarfrost everywhere. Under the cedar, there's a big cedar tree, and there's Father Lewis under the tree, and the hoarfrost comes. And it's like a sign from God, you know. Now, Merton wasn't a saint. If you've read enough of his works, you know that. And he said once, I don't want to be a saint. He wanted to be a saint. He just didn't want to be a canonized saint. That's what, because he said, if they try to canonize me, just think of all the things they're going to find out when they look into my history. So he said he didn't want to be a saint. But anyway, so he was a teacher, he was a spiritual director, he was a mentor, he was a friend. And that's really, you know, that's all the things I wanted to tell you. It's about Merton as a person. It's just about a man who was just marvelous. You know, he was kind, he could be irritable too. If he was working on a book, forget it. And you know, if we wanted something as novices, we always had to ask. And I think one time I went and knocked on his door. I wanted to know if I could take a pocket watch with me because I was going to go for a long walk and I didn't want to miss Vespers. And he looked at me, he says, just take the damn thing. I said, okay, sorry. But I knew him well enough that it didn't hurt me or anything like that. Another time while we were having spiritual direction, I could tell he was excited because he was bouncing around. Oh, he says, let me tell you what happened today. He said, I got this thing in the mail. It's a record. You know, remember they had the big 33.5 RPMs or whatever? He said, and he loved jazz. He said, I just got a record from Cannonball Adderley. You probably don't know who it is, but I didn't either. But he said, let's listen to it. I can't wait to hear it. So he pulls out this what did he call it, a gramophone or something, and puts this thing on, he puts it on. And we sat there for like 20 minutes listening to jazz while the rest of the monks were in Vespers. Okay? So and one of the things that Merton always said was, to be a saint is to be whole. To be holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y, human. To be human. And he was human. He wasn't put on. He didn't think he was really, oh, look at me, I've written all these books and I've made millions of dollars for the monastery. Nope. He wasn't that way at all. And I can stop now. But anybody have any questions? Yes. 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 Yeah. He thought that the farms building, the Gethsemane food industry, you know, the fruit cakes and cheese, they don't do cheese anymore, but they used to have cheese and they used to have smoked hams. Oh my gosh, I used to work with the smoked hams, and we'd hang them in this big, looked like a silo. They'd be smoked. We didn't eat meat. And here I am smelling this meat. But anyway, yeah, he complained about that. He said, monks shouldn't be doing this. But on the other hand, what are monks supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be making a living, right? And yes, before Vatican II, when you went into a monastery, you either became a choir monk or a brother. They weren't the same at all, okay? Choir monks, all of them sang in choir, etc., and became priests. And the brothers didn't. Okay, after Vatican II, all the monasteries changed. And all the monks were just monks. Some were priests, some weren't. Okay, and when that happened, Gethsemane lost about 60 lay brothers. Okay, so they went from 140 to 80 or something like that. So, yes, you know, those are the kind of things that bothered him. But on the other hand, you know, he had a record player, you know, and I will never forget, on when Kennedy was assassinated, 1963, November 22nd, 1963, I was cleaning the latrines. That was my job that day. I was cleaning the latrines. And I saw Father Lewis coming back from his hermitage. And I went out, because I could talk to him, okay? I said, Father Lewis, I said, President Kennedy was just assassinated. And he got this crestfallen look on his face. And he thought, oh my gosh, he said, and he was thinking about Jackie. He said, oh, poor Jackie and those kids. And later on in one of his books, he said he always worried that Kennedy would be assassinated. He always worried about that. And now, well, you know how the story goes. And as a matter of fact, he wrote a letter to Jackie Kennedy, and had every one of us novices also sign it. And then she sent us pictures of their inauguration and stuff, and I still have mine. Anyway, any other questions? Nobody really, yes? Never. At least not to me. And I never heard him talk about it in a lecture or anything like that. Now, I read about it, obviously, and I learned more just from listening to Bill here and I can't wait to read the book. But no, he didn't talk about that. He didn't talk about his family much at all. Other questions? How did I find? That's a really good thing. I entered in June, and I was given the habit in August of '62, and I think it was probably in the winter. I was doing sign language with one of the other novices, and he was holding a book of a Thomas Merton book, and I kind of looked at him like, "Who is he?" He looked at me and he says, "He's sitting over there." I didn't know that. Okay, and in retrospect, I've talked to many other people who have told the exact same story. They became Father Timothy, who was abbot for years, and Brother Paul, said they didn't know he was Thomas Merton. Now, there's one person who did know, and that was, I don't know why he knew, but that was James Finley, okay? And he was so, what's the word? He was such in awe of this, that he was looking at and talking to Thomas Merton, that he couldn't say anything. He didn't blah, blah, he was just out of it. And so finally, Father Lewis said, let me tell you something. You're going to have to get over this so we can actually talk, okay? And he finally did get over it. But, James Finley, by the way, had a very similar past to mine. He had been abused, and he spent a lot of he left after about 6 years. I stayed 2 years. And we were good friends, if you can be good friends without being able to talk. But we did have sign language. We could communicate. It just was different. It was different. And it wasn't like ESL or American ASL. It wasn't like that at all. It was old sign language. And it come around since like the 13th century, because 1298 is when they started the Cistercians. And I would say, I don't know this personally, but I would say that after his brother died, Thomas Merton, of course he wrote a poem, that his first reaction is always to write a poem about something. He wrote a beautiful poem, which I don't even know what book it's in, but you can find it. But I think he then did develop a much more full awareness of his brother, and like you brought out, the sanctity.
Thomas Merton wrote the elegy to his brother, and it begins, "My sweet brother."
Yeah.
Thomas Merton had never considered his brother sweet at all. Yet, a guy in England, Michael Woodward, I communicated with him because he wrote a nice description. He's a poet. He wrote an analysis of that poem. And I got him, we were talking to each other, email, and in the line he used to begin was, he said, before I describe this poem, you have to understand the context. Apropos of what you're saying, Woodward says, it took the death of John Paul to bring out from Thomas his love.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So but Thomas was he was a reserved person. He was he didn't talk much about himself, but he held it in. But it was that death that turned it around, and he writes the poem. So on the one hand, the poem doesn't make any sense because it's discontinuous. But on the other hand, it's a bridge to what's to come. And it opened Thomas up in one way. Anyway.
Very good, very good. I'm going to say one last story, and then we're going to quit, okay? I'd been there about a year, and Father Lewis said, I want you to stop by the bakery sometime, after morning work, and they're going to give you something to bring to me. I didn't question him. I said, sure, no problem. So I went to the bakery, and Brother Nicholas was there, and he signed language to me, and he said, this is for the boss, And so I'm walking up there, I'm wondering, what is in here? It was a little cooler, And when you shake it, it was had ice in it. I thought, I wonder what this is. But I didn't look at it. I thought, I'm just going to take it to him. So I took it up, and he was in the Hermitage, and I knocked on the door, and he said, oh, thank you, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, you want to see what's in here? I said, of course I do. He opened it up, and there were 2 cans of Pabst Blue Ribbon. I hope it was a treat. It wasn't something that happened on a regular basis. He didn't offer me any, so but if he had, I might have sat and had a beer with him. That'd have been fun. Anyway, that's all I have to say. All right?
Thank you all so much. Stick around. I'm at the narthex. Mingle around a little bit. Dr. Megan will be signing his book. So thanks for coming. Okay, thank you. It's awesome, Dr. Megan.
I said seriously, I can't wait. I'm going to read
Thank
it.